Chapter 1. Hana Okoro's fingers already traced the letter's frayed edge inside the open library book, the script pulling her closer despite the closing bell. The paper felt fragile beneath her touch, its edges softened by years of handling, and the faint ridge of dried ink rose like a scar under her nail. The words curved in a slant that matched a note her mother once left on the kitchen table before the accident, the same uneven loops that had once held grocery lists and reminders about rain. She read the first line twice, the ink's slight gloss catching the overhead light, and something in her chest tightened as if the message had been written yesterday rather than decades ago. Outside the aisle window, the valley road curved toward the old mill, its wheel turning slow in the last light, the water below glinting with the dull sheen of late afternoon. A librarian's footsteps approached the aisle, the rubber soles whispering over the carpet in measured beats that grew louder with each step. Hana pressed the book shut around the letter but kept one finger marking the spot, the pressure steady against the spine. Her breath caught as the footsteps paused at the end of the row. She waited, pulse tapping at her throat, until the sound turned back toward the desk and faded into the broader hush of the room. Only then did she open the book again. The signature at the bottom read only an address for the Quilting-Circle, the same one printed on the faded flyer pinned near the door, its ink a muted blue that matched the loops above it exactly. She slipped the letter into her coat pocket. The paper's warmth against her palm made the decision feel irreversible, as if the ink had already begun to settle into the lining, claiming a place that could not be undone. The closing bell rang once, a single low tone that traveled through the shelves like a warning, and Hana stood and carried the book to the return cart without looking back, her free hand curled around the hidden edge in her pocket. Outside the library, she walked the valley path without checking her phone. Her fingers found the pocket seam each time doubt rose, tracing the stitching that held the coat together, the thread rough under her skin. The path followed the creek where children sometimes left bottle caps in the shallows, their metal edges winking like small forgotten coins. A dog barked from a yard she passed, the sound sharp and brief before it settled into silence. She did not quicken her step. Instead, she let the rhythm of her own breathing steady her, each inhalation carrying the cool scent of damp earth and pine needles that lined the trail. At the cottage, she unfolded the letter under lamplight. The kitchen table held a single plate from breakfast, crumbs still gathered at one edge, catching the glow like scattered dust. The signature matched the Quilting-Circle's address written on the back in the same hand. She set the paper flat and studied the loops again, wondering if the writer had known her mother only the shape of her absence, the way the letters slanted leftward as if leaning into a wind only they could feel. The cottage around her remained still, the clock above the sink marking time with its steady, indifferent ticks. She tucked the letter away again before the question of what voice it carried could be answered aloud. The lamp cast a circle of light that stopped at the edge of the table. Beyond it, the cottage held its ordinary quiet, the clock ticking above the sink, the kettle waiting empty on the stove, its metal surface reflecting nothing but the faint outline of her own hesitation. Morning light found Hana at the kitchen table still undecided. The fabric of her sleeve caught on the paper's corner when she reached for her tea. She pulled the sleeve free and smoothed the letter flat once more, the address sitting beneath her thumb, the ink neither faded nor new. Questions crowded in. Had her mother kept this from her deliberately, or had the letter simply waited for the right moment to surface? She traced one loop with her fingertip, feeling the paper shift slightly under the pressure, as though it might slip away if she looked too long. She stood at last, coat already on, letter secured inside the pocket. The path to the meeting address led past the mill and along the creek again, the water murmuring low as it passed over stones worn smooth. She did not tell anyone where she was going. The gate at the end of the path stood open, its hinges quiet in the still air, the wood pale where hands had worn it smooth over years. The unanswered question lingered as she reached the gate, whose handwriting invited her into a memory that was never meant to be shared. She paused with her hand on the latch. Inside the pocket, the letter's edge pressed against her fingers once more, and for a moment the paper seemed to hold the weight of another hand that had written it long ago, a presence both familiar and unreachable. Hana stepped through. The yard beyond held rows of fabric squares drying on lines, each one stitched with threads that caught the light differently, their colors shifting from muted gray to the soft blue of early sky as the breeze moved them. A woman with a low, rhythmic voice spoke from the porch, her words half lullaby and half instruction, the cadence drawing Hana forward without command. Hana listened without interrupting, the sound settling into the spaces between her thoughts. The air carried the faint scent of starch and old wood, mingled with the sharper note of sun-warmed cotton. Inside the circle room, the tables stood arranged in a loose square. Dahlia Moreau tilted her head while observing the empty chairs, her gaze lingering on each vacant space as though measuring the silence they held. Vera Singh folded her arms, then unfolded them as she studied a half-finished square, the motion restless yet contained. Juno Rivera rolled her shoulders once and set down a spool of thread, the wooden reel clicking softly against the tabletop. Anika Patel leaned forward from her seat, her notebook open but her pen still capped, the blank page waiting like an unasked question. Hannah took the remaining chair. She kept a letter in her pocket. The group began passing squares without asking her name. Each square carried a small embroidered scene that shifted when held at an angle, revealing a face or a doorway that had not been visible a moment before. No one remarked on it. Dahlia spoke first, her voice low and steady. The threads remember what the mind sets down. The others added stitches in turn, their needles moving in quiet rhythm. Hannah traced the edge of her own square with one finger, feeling the fabric warm under her touch. A single thread loosened and rewove itself into the pattern of a kitchen table holding crumbs, the detail emerging as if drawn from her own morning hesitation. The square in her hands now showed the library aisle she had left behind. The letter lay open across one corner, its script clear against the faded cloth. Hannah set the square down without comment. The magic in the room had already begun to spread outward, carrying the shape of her hesitation into the next square that reached her, the threads pulling forward with a quiet insistence she could not yet name. Chapter 2. Hannah Okoro stepped into the circle room while Dahlia Moreau's voice already filled the space with its even cadence, low and measured like the steady pull of thread through layered cloth. "The stitches hold what hands once touched," Dahlia said, her words settling across the table like folded cloth, each syllable lingering in the warm air that carried faint traces of dust and pressed linen. The room itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm, its tall windows letting in the last slant of afternoon light that caught on scattered spools and half-worked pieces. Vera Singh unfolded her arms and reached for a half-finished square, her movements deliberate, fingers brushing the edge as though testing its give. Juno Rivera set down her needle and watched the fabric shift under Vera's fingers, a small crease forming between her brows before smoothing away. Anika Patel leaned forward, pen still capped beside her notebook, the paper edges already smudged from earlier notes. Hannah took the empty chair and kept her hands on the table edge, the wood cool and worn smooth under her palms. The letter stayed in her pocket, its paper edge pressing against her hip with each shallow breath she drew. She felt the weight of it there, a constant reminder of the choice that had brought her to the circle, and she wondered how long she could keep the folded pages from dictating every movement. Dahlia tilted her head once toward the chairs, her dark eyes registering the new arrival without breaking the flow of her words, then continued without pause. The women passed the first square clockwise. Its edges showed small running stitches in faded blue, the thread worn thin in places where countless fingers had worked before. The square reached Hannah. Cedar and rain rose from the threads at once, sharp enough that her grip loosened, the sudden clarity of it cutting through the room's quiet like a remembered downpour on tin roofing. She caught the fabric before it fell and laid it flat, her breath catching as the scent pulled the image of her childhood porch forward. The boards wet under afternoon downpours, the cedar chest at the far end holding winter blankets, the air thick with the clean bite of soaked wood and distant earth. Her throat tightened around the memory she had not expected here, and for a moment she tasted the sharp tang of unshed rain on her tongue. Questions crowded in. How had this square found its way to her, and what else might surface if she kept her hands moving? She threaded her needle and began a row of stitches along the bottom seam, the motion automatic yet careful. Her index finger traced the fabric edge with each pull, the way it always did when thoughts gathered, feeling the slight resistance where the layers met. The porch boards returned, this time with the sound of her mother's shoes on wet wood, a soft scuff that echoed in the present stillness. Hannah kept the needle moving, each piercing tug anchoring her to the table, even as the memory threatened to pull her elsewhere. She did not speak, pressing her lips together to hold back the words that might betray the sudden flood in her chest. Dahlia's gaze rested on Hannah's shoulders. The slight stillness there, and stayed, her head remaining tilted, as though listening beyond the stitches for something unspoken. No one else looked up. Vera passed the next square to Juno, who added 3 small knots along one side, her wrist turning with practiced economy. The square released a faint smell of warm bread and sugar before the scent thinned again, the sweetness dissolving into the air like steam from a cooling loaf. Anika watched the knots form but added nothing yet, her capped pen tapping once against the notebook's edge in a rhythm that matched the room's quiet pulse. Another square came to Hannah. This one carried the echo of laughter from a kitchen she recognized only by the way it lifted at the end, her sister's voice cutting through steam from a kettle, the sound bright and fleeting. Hannah pressed the needle through both layers harder than needed, the thread biting into the cloth and holding as her pulse quickened. She finished the stitch and smoothed the surface with her palm, the fabric warm now from her touch, and bit back the urge to name the memory aloud. What would it change if she did? The circle seemed to test such silences, and she felt the weight of Dahlia's continued watchfulness, like an extra layer settling over her own. "The patterns change when the light moves," Juno said, her voice dry but steady, her fingers pausing mid-motion as she rolled one shoulder to ease a knot of tension. She reached for a new spool, the thread unwinding with a soft rasp. Vera nodded once and unfolded her arms again, her eyes flicking briefly toward the window before returning to her work. Dahlia said nothing. Her eyes remained on the table, though her head stayed tilted toward Hannah's side, the angle catching the light along her jaw. Hannah bit the inside of her cheek and continued the row, the faint metal tang taste grounding her against the urge to speak. The cedar smell had faded but left the fabric cooler under her touch, its surface now holding the faint impression of her earlier grip. She finished the stitches and slid the square to Anika, whose acceptance came with a slow turn of the piece under the light before she added a single cross-stitch, the motion precise. Her pulse still moved uneven in her wrists, a reminder that the square had left something behind, even as it passed onward. The circle worked in the same quiet rhythm for another set of squares. Each one released a small trace of scent or sound that no one named. Old paper with its dry, inky whisper. River mud softened by time, the sharp bite of cut grass clinging to summer afternoons. The women added their stitches and passed the work onward, their breaths sinking in the pauses between pulls. Hannah kept her finger on the seam of whatever square she held, tracing the raised thread until the next hand took it, each contact stirring questions she could not voice. How much of herself might these fabrics draw out before the circle noticed? A short laugh came from Juno's end of the table, low and quick, breaking against the walls and falling away like a dropped pin. It broke the moment, but did not dispel it. Dahlia's watchfulness did not shift. She observed the empty spaces between stitches on the square now in front of her, then looked once more at Hannah's still hands, the glance holding long enough to register the uneven rise of her shoulders with each breath. Hannah finished her row on the final square of the round. The last trace of rain smell lifted from the threads and left only cotton and starch, the ordinary scents of the workroom reclaiming their place. She passed the square to Vera and rested her palms flat on the table, feeling the grain beneath them as though it might steady the uneven beat in her chest. The letter in her pocket felt heavier now, though she had not touched it, its presence a quiet pressure that made her wonder if staying seated marked her already. Dahlia stood first. The others followed toward the side table where cups and a teapot waited, steam rising from the spout to carry the plain smell of leaves and the faint clink of porcelain against wood. Hannah remained seated. Her finger found the fresh seam on the square she had just finished, and traced it again from one end to the other, the raised line a small anchor against the pull of questions she could not yet answer. Dahlia reached the doorway and paused. Her glance crossed the table and settled on Hannah's bent head for the length of one breath, the pause stretching just long enough to leave the open question of whether Hannah's silence had already marked her as an outsider who cannot stay. Then she stepped through, and the door settled behind her, the sound soft yet final in the settling quiet. Chapter 3. Hannah's palm found the workroom door before the others had gathered, the wood giving under her push with a low creak that carried into the room like a held breath released. Sunlight slanted through the high window in narrow bands, catching on motes of dust that drifted above the long table in slow spirals, each particle catching gold before vanishing into shadow. Dahlia stood there already, her fingers sliding squares into place one by one, while a half-remembered tune drifted from her throat in broken phrases. The older woman did not look up at first. Her voice held the rhythm of something half-sung, the notes rising and falling without words, each fragment lingering like a thread left loose on the edge of forgetting. Hannah paused in the threshold, the air thicker here than in the hallway, weighted with the hush of unfinished work and the faint pulse of something older, something that waited beneath the surface of cotton and silence. Hannah stepped inside, and the door settled behind her with a soft click that seemed to seal the room away from the rest of the house. She crossed to the table, her shoes quiet on the floorboards that had been worn smooth by years of footsteps, the grain beneath her soles telling of countless women who had stood in this same place before dawn or after dusk. The air smelled of starch and old cotton, faintly threaded with the sharper trace of metal from the needles resting in their tin, and beneath that a warmer note, perhaps the residue of skin warmed by labor. Dahlia's head remained bent over the fabric, the lullaby continuing in soft fragments that seemed to match the measured movements of her hands, each note a question without an answer. Hannah reached for the nearest square at the same moment Dahlia's hand moved to straighten its edge. Their fingers met on the cotton, neither pulling back at once. The contact held for a breath longer than necessary, skin against skin, registering the warmth each carried from outside, the faint roughness of Dahlia's knuckles against the smoother give of Hannah's palm. Inside her chest something tightened, a small knot of recognition she could not yet name. The needle waited in Dahlia's other hand. Without speaking, they began the row together, the thread pulling through in matched pulls that echoed the low hum still drifting between them. Hannah kept her touch light on the cloth, feeling the grain shift under each stitch, the slight resistance as the needle pierced and the fabric yielded, then the soft give as the thread settled into place. The lullaby from Dahlia stayed low, its melody settling into the space between their hands like a current neither chose to break. Hannah's thoughts turned inward, circling the question of why she had come early at all, why the room drew her before the circle formed. She felt the warmth of Dahlia's presence beside her, steady and unhurried, and wondered what the older woman carried that allowed her to hum half a song without finishing it. Tension gathered along the seam they worked, subtle at first, then tightening as the memory surfaced. Hannah's breath caught when the pull of the thread brought forward the sound of her mother's voice on a night years earlier, the same tune rising from the next room before the departure that followed. The memory pressed into the fabric without warning, the notes clear inside the stitches, as if the thread itself carried them outward. She saw again the dim hallway light, heard the creak of the front door, felt the sudden absence that followed the final verse, the way the silence afterward had stretched like an unfinished row. Her fingers faltered only once before resuming, the needle now moving with deliberate care, each pass away to anchor what threatened to drift. Dahlia's head tilted slightly, her eyes staying on the work. She registered the change in Hannah's breathing, yet kept the needle moving at the same steady pace, the silence holding the echo in place rather than letting it scatter. No question came. Instead, the older woman's shoulders eased fractionally, an invitation offered through stillness alone. Hannah added 3 stitches in succession, drawing the memory farther into the square with each pass instead of turning from it. The thread grew taut beneath her fingertips, anchoring what she had carried alone until now, and she wondered whether Dahlia could feel the weight shifting between them, or whether the silence was simply another kind of listening. The square turned under their hands once, the edge smoothing as they aligned the next section. Dahlia spoke then, her voice low and even as she asked whether the thread color felt right for the row ahead. The question hung without pressure, an opening left for whatever answer might come, her gaze still fixed on the fabric as though the words were merely another stitch. Hannah paused before replying, the measured space in her words inviting nothing more. Her fingers traced the fresh scene she had just finished, the raised line, a steady line beneath her touch. She felt the warmth of shared hands lingering there, the faint pulse of her own heartbeat against the cotton. Inside, her thoughts turned once more to the lullaby's origin, to the night her mother had sung it and then left, and she wondered if answering now would invite the memory to claim more space than she was willing to give. She said the color held well enough and left it there, the sentence closing the moment before it could widen into anything further. Dahlia nodded once, the motion small, and passed the square back without comment. Hannah accepted it, her hands steady, though her pulse quickened at the brief brush of fingers again. The lullaby memory thinned with each new pull of thread, the mother's voice giving way to the ordinary weight of cotton and the faint starch scent of the table. Yet the question remained, turning beneath the surface, whether the square had absorbed more than stitches, whether the melody now belonged to the quilt, or remained hers alone to bear. When the row finished, Dahlia nodded once at the completed work. She stepped back from the table, her hands resting at her sides now, the motion unhurried yet final. The fabric stayed warm where their palms had rested together, the warmth lingering after the separation like a residue, neither acknowledged aloud. Hannah remained at the table, her fingers returning once more to the seam, tracing the path they had made together, feeling the faint echo of the half-sung tune settle deeper into the cotton. The door to the hallway opened behind them. Vera and Juno entered first, their voices low as they crossed toward the chairs, the scrape of wood against floor breaking the room's earlier hush. Anika followed, carrying an extra spool of thread that caught the light from the window and sent a brief glint across the table. Dahlia moved to greet them without looking back at the square, her greeting a murmured phrase that folded into the newcomer's conversation. Hannah stayed where she stood, the question of the lullaby's place still open between the stitches and what she had kept inside. The fabric held the trace of the melody, yet offered no sign whether it would stay there or return to her alone when the circle gathered again. Chapter 4. Veera Singh unfolded the half-finished section across the table while Hannah Okoro threaded her needle, the cotton edges catching on a loose splinter from the wood. Light from the single window slanted across the grain, catching threads already in place and turning them pale silver. Vera's fingers moved with the same care she used for her notebooks, pressing each fold flat even as the fabric resisted. Her precise diction already questioned the emerging layout. The grid here pulls the eye left when the seams suggest a rightward drift, Vera said, her fingers smoothing a crease that refused to flatten under pressure. She watched the way the lines she had drawn earlier refused to meet the new edges, and the old doubt she kept in her notes stirred again. Hannah kept the needle steady, the eye catching the thread only after 3 attempts, each pass drawing the dark patch closer to the center where it might settle without argument. The thread slipped twice before it held. She felt the slight tremor in her own hand and wondered whether the others noticed. The darker patch met Vera's sketched grid at an angle that refused alignment. Their voices overlapped for the first time in the room's quiet. "That curve belongs elsewhere," Hannah said, her measured pauses leaving space for the fabric to answer instead. She slid the patch an inch to the left, then paused, waiting to see whether Vera would object. Vera's reply cut across the words, sharp at the edges yet not unkind. "The notes I kept last week marked this exact repetition as a flaw, not a feature." Her arms folded across her chest, the motion tight, the fabric of her sleeves whispering against each other. She unfolded them again almost at once, as if the gesture had cost her something she preferred to keep hidden. Hannah's stitch pierced through both layers, revealing the hidden curve beneath Vera's lines. It mirrored the doubt Vera once recorded in her own notes, the ink still faint where it had bled into the paper's grain. The thread pulled taut. Vera's breath caught for half a second. She saw the same hesitation she had written down weeks ago now stitched into the cotton, undeniable. Her arms folded again, then slowly lowered, palms resting on the table's edge. The fabric resisted at first, then gave with a soft give that eased the line between them. Shoulders eased in the same moment, though neither woman named the shift aloud. The hesitation in the fabric's pull became shared, a recognition that passed through the cotton without needing words. From the doorway, Anika Patel leaned forward, her posture eager before settling back against the frame. She watched without interrupting, the researcher's gaze noting how the pattern shifted under their hands. The square absorbed the adjustment, its surface warming where the stitches crossed the earlier rows. Anika's fingers twitched once at her side, as if she might reach for her own notebook, then stilled. She wondered how long the two women would continue without acknowledging the echo forming between them. Hannah's fingers lingered on the reconciled seam, tracing its length once more as the room held its breath around the new alignment. A faint metal-sharp scent lifted from the seam, belonging to neither memory they carried. It cut through the starch and cotton, sharp as a forgotten tool left in rain. Hannah's fingertips held the trace, the scent clinging past the next pull of thread. She pressed her thumb against the seam and felt the unexpected coolness there, like a coin warmed only on one side. Vera named the repetition in the pattern, her voice warming as the words found the curve again. It echoes the valley paths that turn back on themselves. The generational echo stayed unnamed between them, though the fabric held it steady. Juno Rivera rolled her shoulders once, the motion easing tension without breaking the work's rhythm. Dahlia Moreau tilted her head from her place at the end of the table, observing the stitchers as the row lengthened under their combined hands. The square passed onward to the next section, the motion unhurried. Anika's quiet observation recorded the moment the two women finally worked side by side, their needles moving in offset time. The metal-sharp scent lingered on Hannah's fingertips, refusing to fade into the ordinary scents of the room. Hannah traced the seam again, the action pulling her thoughts toward the lullaby that had thinned earlier yet refused to vanish entirely. She remembered the way her grandmother's voice had once followed the same turning paths Vera described, yet the connection remained just out of reach. Vera's pattern recognition softened the earlier skepticism, the precise diction giving way to something closer to warmth. The fabric released another trace of the scent, faint but insistent, as if the stitches had drawn it from a place outside their individual pasts. Anika remained at the doorway, her inquisitive tone held in check as she watched the alignment settle. The circle's shared silence absorbed the clash in its softening without fanfare. Vera spoke the pattern's repetition once more, the words settling into the cotton like an offered bridge. "The same turn appears in every other block," she said, almost to herself. Hannah glanced up, meeting Vera's eyes for the length of one slow stitch, then looked down again. The question of whose memory the scent belonged to stayed unspoken between them. The row neared completion under the combined work. The square turned slightly to catch the window's light. Hannah's body carried the scent now, the metal edge resting against her skin as she reached for the next thread. Annika stepped closer without crossing the threshold, her body language shifting from forward lean to settled acceptance. The fabric held the new curve without resistance, its surface no longer warm from argument. Vera's arms stayed unfolded, the change in posture marking the softening that had taken root during the shared stitching. The open question turned beneath the surface stitches, waiting for the next hand to claim or release it. Anika's voice broke the held moment from the doorway, clear and carrying the weight of observation. "Does the repetition belong to the quilt, or has it already begun naming us?" Chapter 5. Juno Rivera drove her needle through the cotton before the others had found their places, the first knot already tightening around an old valley photograph that rose from the square like steam from a kettle. The image hovered above the table, its edges frayed and sepia-toned, showing figures bent over crates of apples in a field that no longer existed. Light from the overhead lamp caught the frayed borders, casting faint shadows that shifted as if the figures themselves might straighten and glance upward. Dahlia Moreau tilted her head, watching the photograph settle without comment, her fingers still curled around the strap of her bag, as though she had not yet decided whether to stay or retreat into the hallway. Vera Singh unfolded her arms and leaned closer to trace the pattern of knots with one finger, the motion slow, deliberate, her brow creasing at the way the threads seemed to pulse once before holding still. Anika Patel settled back in her chair, her earlier question about naming left hanging as the image pulled everyone's attention inward. She exhaled through her nose, a small sound that barely disturbed the air. The laughter arrived next, not as memory, but as a sound that filled the room's corners and made the lamps flicker. Harvest laughter, bright and overlapping, carried the scent of turned earth and cider, yet each note carried an edge of absence that pressed against the women's ribs. Shoulders tightened around the table, cloth pulled taut under careful hands, and no one reached to still the vibrating air. Juno's stitches continued their intricate loops, amplifying the sound until it became a presence rather than an echo. The voices layered over one another, children calling across rows, a man's low chuckle answering a woman's reply, until the room itself seemed to breathe with them. Anika's hand rose halfway to her throat before she lowered it again, the motion arrested by the sudden weight of recognition. Vera's tracing finger paused mid-line, her eyes narrowing as though measuring the distance between the sound and its source. Hana Okoro set her needle down on the wooden surface, the metal clinking once against the grain. Her fingers rested along the edge of the new square, feeling the warmth the laughter left behind, a warmth that did not belong to the thread or the cotton. She spoke into the suspended moment, her voice measured and soft enough that the words seemed to join the fabric rather than interrupt it. That laughter belonged to the Rivera family before the orchard was sold. The photograph pulsed once, its figures turning as if responding to the acknowledgement, then held steady. Dahlia's shoulders eased a fraction, though her gaze remained fixed on the hovering image. The slight nod she offered more acknowledgement than agreement. Vera withdrew her hand entirely, folding it into her lap where her thumb pressed against her knuckle in a steady rhythm. Juno's shoulder rolled back in a familiar motion meant to loosen the sudden weight in her chest. Yet the movement only drew the laughter tighter around her own wrists. "Practical reasons brought me here," she said, her tone dry, as she knotted another loop that fixed the image more firmly in place. "Not to drag up what the valley already chose to set aside." The words landed without malice, but the sound of laughter thinned at their edges, leaving a hollow that each woman felt in the space between her own breaths. Inside the pause that followed, Juno felt the familiar press of old arguments she had rehearsed alone. The land had changed hands for taxes, the trees had come down for new roads, and silence had been the price of moving forward. She kept her eyes on the square, refusing to meet the quiet that now settled across the table like a second cloth. The circle continued in heavier silence, needles moving through layers that now carried the photograph's weight as if it had always belonged there. Dahlia's rhythmic guidance kept the stitches even, though her low voice stayed quiet rather than offering the usual half-remembered phrases. Instead she counted under her breath, each number a small anchor against the fading laughter. Vera's pattern recognition shifted to the new knots, her diction precise as she noted how the loops mirrored fence lines from the image, the observation offered without looking up. Anika watched without leaning forward, her posture settled into acceptance of the shift the stitches had introduced, though her fingers worried the corner of her own unfinished square in small, repetitive folds. Hana remained after the others gathered their things and rose, the door closing behind Vera and Anika with a soft click that left the room smaller. Her hand rested near Juno's finished section, close enough to feel the faint vibration the laughter still carried but without touching the threads. Juno stayed as well, her fingers smoothing the square's corner, where the photograph had begun to fade at the edges. Outside, wind moved through the remaining orchard rows, a dry rustle that reached the window but did not enter. The clock on the far wall ticked louder in the emptied space, marking the ordinary passage of time against the lingering echo. "The valley will forget the photograph by morning," Juno muttered, the words directed at the fabric rather than at Hana, her dry wit thinned to something closer to resignation. The clock on the far wall ticked louder in the emptied space, marking the ordinary passage of time against the lingering echo. Hana traced the edge of the square, her fingertips following the path where the laughter had clung, the metal-sharp residue from earlier stitches mixing with the new warmth. She did not lift her gaze from the threads, though the line of her mouth tightened as if holding back another acknowledgement. The photograph dimmed further, its figures blurring as if the fabric itself were deciding what to retain. Juno's body language eased only slightly, the shoulder roll repeated once more without releasing the tension her knots had released into the circle. Hana's measured pauses lengthened between each breath. Her empathetic listening turned inward to the way the laughter had named the loss without requiring explanation. The deadline of the valley's forgetting settled over the table like dust, settling on unused shelves, coating the remaining thread and needles. Outside the window, the valley fields stretched under dusk, their ordinary rows unchanged by the echoes the quilting had drawn forward. Yet inside the room the stitches held the harvest laughter as a literal layer, one that refused to dissolve into the cotton's weave. Hana did not answer the muttered words about forgetting. Her hand stayed near the square, tracing where the image had been, the action pulling at the withheld grief she carried from her own quiet tragedy. The deadline of the valley's forgetting settled over the table like dust settling on unused shelves, coating the remaining thread and needles. Juno's question emerged at last, low and even, as the final threads drew the last visible figure into the weave. How many more echoes will vanish before the circle can decide whether to keep them? Chapter 6. Anika Patel pushed open the door to the quilting room just as Dahlia Moreau set the first needle into a fresh square. Morning light slanted through the high windows in narrow bands, catching on the scattered pins and the uneven edges of unfinished patches. Anika's questions had already taken shape during the walk from the research station, where the valley's records had offered only fragments of harvest tallies and missing names. They left her mouth before the hinges settled into place. What does any of this change for the valley once the last stitch is tied? The rhythm faltered at once. Needles paused above cotton as the women turned toward the interruption. Vera Singh unfolded her arms, then refolded them across her chest, her gaze sharpening as if measuring the distance between Anika's stance and the table's center. Juno Rivera rolled one shoulder, the motion slow and deliberate, and kept her eyes on the thread in her hand while her jaw tightened. Hana Okoro's fingers traced the edge of her current patch, the motion steady even as the air in the room shifted around the new voice, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the floorboards and the sharper tang of rain on the window glass. Dahlia answered with a single measured phrase. "Preservation," she said, the word low and rhythmic like half a lullaby. The square beneath her hands held the faint outline of an older harvest scene, its laughter already thinning at the borders where thread had begun to loosen. Anika leaned forward across the table, her clear tone pressing against the quiet that usually guided the work. Preservation for whom, if the valley forgets by morning anyway? The question hung there, and the fabric seemed to brighten where her gaze touched it, revealing a date stitched in fine script that had not been visible before, a pale 1897 emerging as though coaxed from shadow by the weight of attention. Hana kept her needle moving, drawing a new seam through the cotton while the date surfaced. The thread carried a scent of cedar and rain, though no one had opened a window, and each pull lengthened the pause between breaths. Dahlia tilted her head slightly, observing the younger woman without lifting her own hands from the work, her eyes holding a quiet assessment that did not reach her lips. "The circle keeps what the valley cannot hold," she said. Anika settled back in her chair, the motion easing the tension that had tightened her posture on arrival, though her fingers still hovered near the edge of the table as if reluctant to release the question entirely. One square passed from Dahlia to her, and the founding date settled into the weave as if it had always belonged there. The room held 3 questions now. Whose family had left the valley in the year the date marked? What silence had been chosen instead of speech when the orchards began to thin? And how did those losses reach forward into the stitches the circle made today? Hannah's measured pauses lengthened between each pull of the thread, her fingers following the seam as though listening through the fabric for answers that might shift beneath her touch. Juno muttered something dry under her breath about practical matters, but the words dissolved before they reached anyone else, leaving only the faint scrape of her chair leg against the floor. Anika traced the date with one fingertip. The cotton warmed under the touch, and for a moment the square carried the weight of a single decision made decades earlier, the kind that altered who remained to speak of it. Dahlia watched without comment, her body still except for the slight tilt of her head. Vera unfolded her arms again, pattern recognition sharpening her eyes as she recognized the year in the narrative forming across patches. Hannah did not look up, though the withheld grief in her own chest stirred at the edges of the new light entering the room. The square moved onward around the table. Each woman added a stitch that carried both Anika's practical question and the 3 questions that remained unanswered. The fabric accepted them without resistance, the magic of the circle shifting to hold the additional layer as threads caught and held the faint pulse of the date. Outside, the valley fields lay unchanged under morning light, their rows ordinary and untouched. Inside, the patches absorbed the inquiry, turning the disruption into another thread among many. Anika's final inquiry came after the square had traveled full circle. What legacy does the circle claim if it never names the silences it has kept? The words landed without accusation, and the table accepted them in a silence that felt like agreement rather than retreat. Dahlia nodded once, the gesture small. Juno's shoulder rolled once more, releasing a fraction of the tension she carried. Vera's diction softened as she remarked on the pattern's new clarity. Hannah's tracing continued, her fingertips pressing the fresh seams flat. The open questions remained among the patches like extra pins left in place. They did not dissolve with the morning light or the ordinary passage of time marked by the clock on the wall. Anika watched the fabric settle, her earlier skepticism easing into something closer to participation. The circle had absorbed the disruption, yet the absorption altered the weave in ways none could yet name. Hannah felt the stir of her own loss rise briefly through the threads she held. She did not speak of it. Instead, she passed the square to the next woman, her body language quiet and contained. The magic in the room had intensified around the date and the questions it raised, revealing that the quilt remembered more than the valley permitted itself to keep. Dahlia's low voice resumed the work with another measured phrase about the next square, but the shift had already occurred. The photograph from the previous session lay nearly gone at the table's edge, its figures blurred beyond recognition. Clara's arrival at dawn would find only this new layer of inquiry in its place. The circle continued, the stitches holding the founding silence alongside the practical question of usefulness. 3 questions and 1 new threat lingered among the pins, waiting for the next woman to draw them forward or leave them untouched. Anika leaned in once more before the session closed, her voice inquisitive rather than confrontational. The date and the thread pulsed faintly under the collective gaze. Juno added a precise knot that amplified the texture of the forgotten year. Vera noted the alignment of patterns without dismissing the echo as sentiment. Dahlia guided the silence that followed, allowing the questions to breathe inside the fabric. The valley's ordinary rhythms pressed at the window, yet the room retained the extra layer the disruption had introduced. Hannah's fingers traced one final seam, carrying the date and the silences into the next square. The magic had spread, naming what the circle had chosen not to remember, and asking what else might surface if the questions continued. The pins held their places. The thread waited. Chapter 7. Vera Singh drew the needle through the long seam where the cedar-scented square met the one edged in faint harvest gold. Her fingers moved with the measured care of someone still testing whether the fabric would hold its secrets or scatter them. The cedar rose in thin curls of scent each time the thread pierced, mingling with the older dust that clung to the table's grain. Hannah Okora sat opposite, tracing the edge of the same seam with her thumb before her own needle followed. Light from the single high window slanted across the squares, catching on loose fibers and turning them briefly silver before they settled again. The room held the low hum of thread pulling taut. No other voices yet, only the occasional creak of wood as someone shifted weight. Outside, wind pressed against the panes in irregular gusts, carrying the faint mineral bite of distant rain that never quite arrived. Dahlia Moreau tilted her head from the far end of the table, watching the alignment without comment. Her eyes moved slowly between the 2 women, noting the way their stitches began to mirror one another. The date from the prior square had faded into the weave, but its pressure remained under every new stitch, a faint indentation that caught the fingertip if one pressed. Vera's arms stayed folded at first, elbows tight against her sides as she assessed the pattern that emerged. The posture kept her shoulders squared, a barrier she had not yet chosen to lower. Hannah's pauses between stitches invited the line to speak before she added another, her breath held just long enough for the thread to settle. She could feel Vera's gaze on the seam even when their eyes did not meet. A quiet scrutiny that asked without words whether the work would bind or fracture further. "This thread pulls two memories into one line," Vera said, her diction crisp even as the fabric warmed beneath her hand. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she watched the way the gold edge caught the cedar's nap, the two textures resisting, then yielding. "I thought they would stay separate, yet the seam refuses the division." Her shoulders shifted a fraction, the first hint of loosening, though her elbows remained drawn close as if guarding the admission. Hannah did not answer at once. Her fingers pressed the fresh seam flat, feeling the cedar scent rise and then the sharper tang of something metal sharp, perhaps rain on an iron roof. The tang arrived without warning, cutting across the harvest gold. She added her stitch anyway, letting the overlap begin, though her wrist tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing. Across from her, Vera's posture remained contained, yet the needle's next pass carried a fraction less precision, as if the speaker were listening for an answer she had not voiced. Hannah's thoughts circled the older woman's words, wondering how much of Vera's own past had been folded away until this shared line forced it forward. The doubt in Vera's tone felt familiar, a mirror she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The pattern clarified under their shared work. Vera's precise eye caught how the gold edge repeated a curve from an older square, one the circle had set aside seasons ago. The repetition pulled at something she had once filed away as irrelevant. She unfolded her arms part way, one hand resting open on the table as she leaned closer. The movement revealed the faint tremor in her wrist, quickly stilled. "I dismissed these echoes as sentiment once. Now the doubt sits inside the cloth itself, stitched where anyone can trace it." Her voice carried the weight of long-held restraint, and her free hand flexed once against the wood before settling again, as though testing the safety of openness. Hannah's needle paused again. The porch scent returned first, wet wood and old paint. Then the distant harvest laugh layered over it, bright and sudden as if carried on wind that should not have reached this room. Beneath both came the sharp tang that belonged to neither memory, cold and metal sharp. Her hands kept moving, but the memories no longer waited their turn. They overlapped inside the seam, pressing against her skin like water finding the same channel twice. Whose porch held the rain that had never fallen on her own childhood home? Whose laugh belonged to the valley or to the home she had left? The questions arrived too quickly for separation, each one brushing the next before she could set it aside. Hannah's breath shortened, and the room's ordinary light seemed to shift around the square, making the threads brighter and then dim again within seconds. She felt her pulse quicken at the intrusion, a private grief pressing upward against the fabric's new weave, threatening to blur the boundary she had kept between her solitary loss and the valley's collective silences. Vera noticed the tremble in Hannah's fingers on the fabric. She unfolded her arms fully now, both hands steadying the square without pulling it away. The gesture was deliberate, the palms flat and open, offering anchorage rather than command. "The pattern matches the doubt I carried alone," Vera said, her voice softening at the edges, the earlier crispness blurring into something nearer warmth. "Yet it does not dissolve the doubt. It places it here, where the stitches can carry it forward." Her eyes lifted briefly to meet Hannah's, holding a question that went unanswered, a test of how far the younger woman would allow the overlap to reach. The blur lasted only as long as it took for Hannah's next breath to settle. In that span, the porch, the tang, and the laugh became one continuous line inside her mind, no longer hers to sort. She felt the weight of each memory press against the others, edges dissolving until she could not name which grief had begun where. Her withheld grief brushed nearer to the surface than she had allowed before, a quiet weight that the seam now held alongside the valley's older silences. Across the table, Vera watched without speaking further, her steadying hand still in place, waiting. Hannah's thoughts raced through the mingled sensations, questioning how much of her own tragedy would have to rise before the quilt could contain it without erasure, and whether the circle's work demanded that surrender or merely invited it. Dahlia's low voice resumed from her place, rhythmic and even, noting the next square without naming the shift. The words carried the cadence of someone accustomed to threading silence back into order. Juno Rivera rolled one shoulder, releasing tension as she observed the settled texture. The motion drew a soft sigh from the bench beneath her. Anika Patel leaned forward, then settled back, her earlier skepticism easing into the new weave, though her mouth remained a careful line. The women exchanged no direct glances, yet the air between them thickened with the unspoken recognition that something irreversible had settled into the cloth. The synthesized section rested in the quilt, its visible thread now carrying histories that had stayed hidden. Vera's final glance met Hannah's across the table, carrying the weight of the pattern they had both claimed. Neither woman looked away at once. The circle broke without further comment, chairs scraping lightly against the floor as women gathered their things. The overlapping echo remained in the room like an added layer the air had not held before. Hannah's fingers traced one final edge of the seam, the question of her own tragedy pressing closer to the stitches that might one day hold it without erasure. The pins stayed in place, waiting for the next hand to draw them or leave them. Chapter 8. Hana Okoro lowered the central patch into the quilt's middle square, where earlier thread still carried the faint heat of other hands. The fabric yielded beneath her fingertips like earth loosened by spring rain, its surface faintly warm, as though it had absorbed the valley's lingering daylight. A low vibration traveled through her palms and up her wrists before she even guided the needle forward. She felt the square settle, heavier than its size suggested, pressing against the table's worn grain. The room itself seemed to hold its breath around her, the cedar scent rising from the floorboards mingling with the sharper edge of distant rain that had not yet arrived. Inside her thoughts, questions stirred. What memory had the cloth absorbed that now resisted being named? Vera Singh unfolded her arms and leaned across the table, her fingers hovering an inch above the patch without touching it. The hesitation in her posture spoke of caution learned over many such gatherings. "That piece carries more than one line," she said, her voice precise and clipped, each syllable measured against the thickening air. "Are you certain it belongs at the center?" "The seams around it are already thin." Hana kept her eyes on the fabric. She measured her answer with the same care she gave each stitch, weighing whether any reply could contain the pressure already building beneath her hands. "It fits where the others thinned." Her needle pierced the edge, and the air around the table thickened at once with the scent of cedar shavings from the floorboards and the distant sharp tang of rain that had not yet fallen. The others watched the thread pull through, their breaths held in the same suspended moment, each face shadowed by lamplight that flickered against the walls. The echo that answered did not fade. Instead it widened, pressing outward until the room seemed to contain an entire valley's silence at once. Names dissolved inside it. First one family line, then another, until only the raw absence of unclaimed ground remained. Hana's fingers paused on the next pull. The needle trembled between them. She could feel the silence threading itself into the work, erasing distinctions, demanding to be carried by every seam. What part of her own past had she hoped to keep separate now bled into this shared emptiness? Juno Rivera's shoulder rolled once, a habitual motion that usually preceded a wry remark. No remark came. She rolled the shoulder again, slower, as though testing whether the joint still belonged to her. Then she drew her bench nearer, the wood scraping softly against the floor, and placed both hands flat against the quilt's edge to hold it steady. Her face showed nothing beyond steady attention, yet the absence of her usual dry comment left a new kind of quiet between them. Hana sensed the shift without looking up, the weight of Juno's presence anchoring the table even as doubt flickered at the edges of her own resolve. Dahlia Moreau tilted her head, studying the spreading darkness without raising her own needle. Her gaze lingered on the patch as if searching for a boundary that might still hold. "The next thread is the deep gray," she said, her voice keeping its even, rhythmic cadence. She offered only the practical instruction, as though naming colors might still contain what the cloth had already released. The larger hush, however, continued to grow around her words, pressing against the circle like an unseen tide. Inside Hana's chest the pressure mounted, not as a single, nameable grief, but as a spreading stillness that shortened her breath and drew her shoulders inward. Her free hand traced the patch's uneven edge again, the motion almost unconscious. The collective forgetting pushed harder against the cloth with every pass, and she sensed her own withheld loss beginning to blur into the older absences, until the two could no longer be separated. The tragedy that had brought her to the valley pressed outward through the stitches, no longer containable within one square. Could any of them name it now without unraveling what little order remained? Anika Patel settled back after leaning forward, her usually inquisitive tone now softened by caution. "This one reaches further than the seams can hold," she said. "How do we keep it from swallowing the rest?" No one answered at first. The silence settled across every pair of hands at the table, and the weight became something no single member could lift alone. The quilt's center darkened visibly, the echo humming like a struck bell whose note refused to die away. Vera's arms folded once more, the motion small yet final, as though she had already measured the cost and found it too high. Anika's fingers drummed once against the tabletop before stilling, her eyes fixed on the trembling needle in Hana's grip. Hana drew the needle through again, slower this time, feeling each fiber resist and then yield. Inside the narrowing focus of her thoughts, she saw the full shape of what she had kept back, the quiet ending that had driven her here, now merging with every earlier loss the valley had refused to name. Her withheld grief no longer fit inside one scene. It leaked into the surrounding squares, demanding acknowledgement from every thread. She wondered whether the others felt the same fracture widening beneath their own fingertips. Juno remained when the others eased their chairs away. She did not speak or look up. Her stitches simply continued in the shared quiet, each pull drawing the persistent hum into tighter order without breaking it. The needle moved steadily between her fingers, anchoring what could still be anchored. The lamplight caught the line of her jaw, set against the deepening resonance that filled the room. Dahlia's voice resumed after a moment, naming only colors and lengths once more, yet the protective rhythm of the circle strained visibly under the scale now evident in the cloth. The gray thread she offered caught the low lamplight and seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it, its color deepening as it passed through her fingers. The central patch stayed half-finished. The vast echo continued to move beneath it, unanswered. Hana kept her fingers on the edge, unwilling to withdraw, yet unable to complete the work before the valley's older silence pressed forward again, ready to reclaim the square and every thread that surrounded it. The question lingered in the air between them, whether the circle could finish before the silence drew the whole quilt back into forgetting. Vera watched the unfinished scene from her place by the wall, arms still folded. Juno's final stitch held the patch in place for now, but the hum beneath it deepened, asking whether any of them would remain when the next pull threatened to loosen everything they had tried to hold. Chapter 9. Dahlia Moreau set her needle down on the table's edge and stepped back, the motion carrying no flourish. The chair beneath her creaked once as weight shifted, then settled into stillness. "The last row belongs to the hands that remain," she said, her low voice even, as though naming the weather. The words left her without echo, absorbed by the lamplight that pooled unevenly over the unfinished central patch. Gray thread there had absorbed the glow instead of returning it, turning the center into a muted hollow where light seemed to sink and vanish. The others looked up from their squares. Anika Patel leaned forward first, her elbows resting on the wood, so that the grain pressed faint lines into her skin. "If the thread must name the valley's losses in one line," she asked, her voice clear yet gentler than before, "which loss arrives first and which waits at the end?" The question hung without pressure. She did not repeat it. Her eyes stayed on the cloth, watching how the half-finished edge lifted slightly where a previous stitch had pulled too tight. Inside her chest, the same question looped once more, quieter. What if the order mattered more than any of them had admitted? What if the wrong loss spoken first unraveled the rest? Hana Okoro's fingers found the edge of the patch, tracing the raised fibers the way she traced a pulse at work. The texture here felt uneven, almost alive, beneath her nail. Bira Singh unfolded her arms, then refolded them once before, settling both hands on the cloth across from her. Their movements synchronized without discussion. They began the seam together, the needles passing through the same layers at staggered intervals. Each push met brief resistance from the layered batting, then gave with a soft sigh of fabric. Juno Rivera rolled her shoulder once and bent to the knots at the corners, her stitches small and tight. The thread between her fingers gleamed briefly before disappearing into the weave. The room held the ordinary sounds of thread pulling and chairs shifting. Outside, the valley's evening settled without wind, pressing a heavier quiet against the single pane of glass. Inside, the fabric lay open, its half-finished center still vulnerable to the hum that had lived beneath it for weeks. That low vibration, once insistent, now waited like a held breath. Anika asked another question, softer now. What if the closing thread holds the quiet endings first, the ones no one named aloud? She watched the needles rather than the faces. Vera's stitches lengthened slightly in answer, then steadied again. The pause had been small, but Hana noticed how Vera's jaw tightened afterward, as though the adjustment cost something. Hana kept her pace even, though the fabric under her thumb felt warmer than the air around it. She wondered whether the warmth came from their hands or from something the squares themselves retained. Her own withheld grief stirred once, a flicker behind the ribs, and she pressed it down by drawing the needle through another precise loop. Midway through the row, the cedar rain scent rose once more, faint and without owner. It belonged to no single square. The odor threaded upward like memory given form, neither entirely pleasant nor unwelcome. Hannah felt it enter her breath and stay there, neither memory nor stranger. For a moment her own withheld grief met it inside her chest, not as weight, but as a second rhythm matching the needles. The two pulses aligned without merging. She drew the thread through, and the sensation passed, leaving only the faint dampness of evening air that clung to the cloth's underside. Juno tied the first knot at the corner, her fingers working without pause. The knot settled into the cloth like a period at the end of a sentence no one had finished speaking. She moved to the next corner without looking up, yet her free hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary against the table edge, steadying something unseen. Dahlia remained at the table's edge, head level, eyes on the seam rather than tilted in observation. Her hands rested empty on the wood. The protective stance had left her shoulders. What remained was simple attendance, the kind given to a thing already underway. She did not speak again, but her breathing had slowed, matching the measured pace of the needles. Vera and Hannah reached the middle of the seam at the same moment. Their needles crossed paths once, then continued on parallel lines. The collective loss the valley had carried alone began to gather along the new stitches, each pull drawing one more unspoken ending into the continuous line. The fabric did not resist. It accepted the additions as though they had always belonged in that order. Beneath the surface, though, Hannah sensed the faint give of older seams, as if they tested whether this new joining would hold under the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Anika settled back against her chair once the final knot was set. The alignment held. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased by a fraction. The unveiling still waited tomorrow, its clock unchanged by the finished seam. Already she felt the press of that deadline in the stiffness of her neck, the way the lamplight had begun to thin into something thinner, less forgiving. The alignment was complete, yet the questions she had voiced still hovered, unanswered, between the four women. Hannah traced the finished edge with one fingertip. The texture already carried belonging before any hand lifted the quilt from the table. It was not warmth or certainty, only the sense that the cloth now remembered its own making. Beneath that recognition lay another, sharper awareness. Once the quilt left this room, the losses it contained would no longer belong solely to them. Juno added the last 3 knots in quick succession, each one anchoring what the hum had tried to loosen. She sat back, shoulder rolling once more as the tension left it, and the motion carried the small sound of joints easing. The group rose together when the lamplight began to thin. No one spoke of the hour. They stood around the table while the last gray of evening crossed the window, turning the quilt's surface into a field of muted contrasts. The quilt lay complete between them, its seams holding the valley's losses in one unbroken line. Outside, the first stars had begun to appear above the ridge, cold and distant. Inside, the scent of cedar and rain lingered faintly, as though reluctant to depart. The question remained at the door, whose memories would surface first when the cloth was shown to the valley tomorrow. The hum beneath the table had quieted, yet the fabric itself now carried the possibility of return. Each woman looked at the finished work without meeting the other's eyes, and in that shared silence the weight of what remained unspoken settled more firmly than any stitch. Chapter 10. They lifted the quilt together at the hall doorway, 4 corners and 1 centerfold balanced between their palms so the edges did not drag against the scuffed pine boards. The fabric carried its own heat, a steady press that traveled up through the seams and into each wrist without needing sun or stove. Anika Patel adjusted her grip first, her fingers sliding along the border until the alignment felt even again. Dahlia Moreau matched the shift without a word, her head tilted as if listening for a rhythm only the cloth still held. Vera Singh walked a half step ahead to clear the path, her steps precise on the uneven floor. The hall opened before them, its high windows catching the afternoon light in flat rectangles across the empty benches. Dust drifted in the shafts, and the air carried the faint resin of old timber mixed with the sharper scent of pine sap from recent repairs. When they reached the central table, the group lowered the quilt in one motion, the material settling with a soft give that released the first faint image, a child's shoe print pressed into wet clay, before the patch smoothed flat and ordinary once more. The release came and went like a single exhale, the image dissolving before anyone could name it, yet the warmth lingered in the air above the cloth-like breath held too long. Hana Okoro kept her hands at her sides once the cloth lay spread. She did not trace the new seam running from the lower left corner upward. Instead, she watched the way the light moved across the stitches, catching on knots that had been pulled tight only hours earlier. The belonging arrived not as a rush, but as the simple fact of remaining in place while the others stepped back. Her fingertips stayed still against her own skirt, the rough weave of the cotton familiar under her touch, and she wondered whether the others noticed how little she needed to reach forward anymore. The question sat with her, neither urgent nor forgotten, as the hall's quiet settled around the table like sediment in still water. Juno Rivera remained at the rear of their small cluster, shoulders rolled once to loosen the line of her jacket. "At least the floorboards will remember who carried it in," she said, the dry edge of the remark landing without force. Anika's mouth lifted at one corner, the smile brief and private, before her arms folded and then unfolded again as she turned toward the approaching residents. The small reaction lingered in the set of her shoulders, as if the comment had loosened something she had not realized was tight. Juno caught the flicker and let her own gaze drop to the nearest patch, where a faint outline of roots still pulsed once before fading. Dahlia stood with her weight settled evenly, no longer angled to shield the table from view. Valley people entered in twos and threes, their voices low as they drew near the quilt. She watched each face without offering the usual guiding phrase, letting the cloth speak in its own time. The air above the patches held a single breath of turned earth and then cleared, the echo spent after one release. Her stance remained open, yet her eyes moved with the same measured attention she once reserved for guarding the circle's perimeter. A young man paused at the edge, his hand twitching as though he might reach out, but Dahlia's stillness seemed to hold him back without a word. Vera named what she saw first. "The thread that runs through every patch is the same length of time the valley kept its doors closed after the last flood," she said, her diction exact, yet carrying the warmth of a person who had stopped counting the cost of belief. The words settled over the table without echo, and the nearest residents leaned closer to follow the line she indicated. One woman's hand hovered above the edge, then withdrew, as though the naming itself required no further proof. Anika shifted her weight, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her, and her eyes met Vera's for a moment that held more acknowledgement than any spoken reply. The quilt surface shifted under the hall light, faint reflections of the gathered faces appearing in the weave itself, cheekbones and collar lines repeating across separate blocks before fading into the next stitch. No one reached to touch. The patterns held for the length of a slow breath and then settled back into ordinary cloth, the reflection passed on without demand. Hannah studied the way the light played across those fleeting likenesses, and felt the question of her own reflection rise and settle in the same quiet interval. The air felt thicker now, weighted by the low murmur that followed each patch's single release. Hannah felt the final private weight inside her loosen as the murmurs grew. It did not leave as a spoken thing. It joined the existing seams the way a dropped stitch is caught and carried forward by the next row. Her shoulders eased by the same fraction that had marked the earlier alignment, and she remained where she stood among the women, rather than moving to the edge. The grief that had once required solitary hours now rested among the other released echoes, neither heavier nor lighter than the rest. She exhaled slowly, tasting the resin in the air, and noticed how the hall's high ceiling seemed to gather the scattered voices into one steady hum. The hall filled with the low recognition that followed each patch's single release. A woman near the front spoke of a lost orchard boundary that matched the one now visible in the central square. An older man nodded at the corner block that held the shape of a doorframe he had not seen since childhood. The forgotten histories appeared not as stories told, but as details. The quilt made visible for the length of one look before they quieted again. Voices overlapped in soft succession, each new murmur drawing another listener forward without urgency. Dahlia's gaze tracked the movement, her posture steady as the room's attention settled deeper into the cloth. Juno stepped back from the group while the last visitors still circled the table. She carried no portion of the quilt with her, only the single question of which losses the next cloth would be asked to receive once this one had been folded away. The door at the far end stood open to the ridgeline, and she moved toward it without looking back at the remaining hands resting on the finished work. The unanswered question traveled with her, steady as the warmth that still lingered in the seams behind her, while the valley light outside waited in unbroken silence.